At first, Clara thought her brother had fallen into a state of denial, that he was hallucinating due to the grief. But the urgency in his voice made her realise something was wrong. Without hesitation, she rushed over. In less than 15 minutes, she was at Carlos's house. He greeted her with wide, frantic eyes, his face pale and trembling. Without saying a word, he led her to the room where the computer was connected to the camera. Clara stood there in silence, watching the screen. At first, there was nothing strange, only the darkness of the sealed coffin. But then the same sound that had chilled Carlos's blood echoed through the room, a faint, almost imperceptible breath, but undeniably human. Clara stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. "It can't be," she whispered. They both stood there frozen, unsure how to react. What did this mean? Alba had been buried. They had witnessed her funeral. There was no way she could be alive, was there? Carlos couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. He jumped to his feet, grabbed his car keys and said, "We're going to the cemetery now." Clara tried to stop him, but the determination in his eyes told her there was no changing his mind. The drive to the cemetery was a whirlwind of thoughts. Carlos drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Clara sat next to him, staring out the window, her mind racing. How could what they saw be real? Was it possible that Alba was alive? By the time they reached the cemetery, it was nearly midnight. The full moon cast an eerie, pale light over the graveyard, making the place look almost otherworldly. Carlos didn't wait. He headed straight for Alba's grave, carrying a shovel he had grabbed from the garage. Clara followed closely behind, anxious and unsure of what was about to happen. Carlos dug with frantic energy. Each strike of the shovel seemed to echo through the stillness of the cemetery. Clara tried to calm him, but he didn't listen. The sound of the earth being moved filled the air, along with his ragged breath. He wasn't going to stop. He was going to reach his daughter's coffin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his shovel struck the wooden lid of the coffin. Both of them fell silent. Clara trembled from head to toe as Carlos took a deep breath and slowly opened the coffin. When the lid creaked open, Carlos's heart stopped. He froze, unable to look inside. His breath was heavy and shallow. For a moment, he couldn't move. Clara gripped his arm, her own hands shaking. Inside the coffin, Alba's body was exactly as they had remembered it. Serene, still. Nothing seemed out of place. But something wasn't right. What had they just seen? What was the truth behind the mysterious breath in the coffin? Then something terrifying happened. Alba's pale, cold lips moved slightly as if trying to say something. A faint exhalation escaped her mouth. "She's alive!" Carlos shouted, his voice trembling with disbelief. In a frantic rush, he started gently shaking his daughter's body. "Alba! Daughter! Please, breathe! Please, breathe!" Clara took a step back, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. It couldn't be possible. Alba had been buried for so many days, yet here she was, seemingly alive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold with growing disbelief. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. How could this be? Suddenly, a sound came from the coffin, but it wasn't Alba's voice. It was something else entirely, distorted, guttural, as though it was coming from deep within the earth. A low, resonant whisper filled with echoes reverberating through the cemetery as though the very ground was alive. Carlos froze, still holding his daughter's body. The air around him felt heavier, denser, as if something malevolent was closing in on them. A suffocating pressure filled the space, and the atmosphere grew thick with unease. "We're not alone," Clara murmured, her voice trembling. There was something else here. Something they couldn't see, but that they could feel in every part of their being. In that instant, Alba's eyes snapped open, but there was nothing human in them. They were completely white, empty, void of life. Carlos instinctively pulled back, releasing his daughter's body, but his eyes couldn't tear away. Alba's gaze seemed to fix on him, but there was no trace of the child he once knew. Something, or someone, was controlling her now. "Dad!" Alba's voice came out, but it wasn't hers. It was deeper, more menacing, almost as though thousands of voices were speaking in unison. The words sent chills down Carlos's spine. His legs buckled and he fell to his knees, overwhelmed. He couldn't process what was happening. A battle raged inside him, a conflict between the love he had for his daughter and the pure, paralysing fear of what she had become. He wanted to embrace her, to hold her, but something deep inside warned him to stay away. "This isn't real! This can't be happening!" he muttered, stumbling backward. Clara, terrified, slowly backed away, fear seizing her. Then, without warning, Alba spoke again. This time her voice was no longer a whisper. It reverberated throughout the entire cemetery, echoing in every corner. "You should have let us rest!" the voice thundered. Carlos felt a dark presence, cold and suffocating, wrapping around him. It wasn't just Alba. There was something bigger, something older, something evil that had awakened. Something they couldn't understand. The lights in the cemetery flickered wildly, and a cold, biting breeze swept through the place. Clara screamed, her voice breaking, and in that instant, Carlos knew they had made a grave mistake by opening the coffin. He stood frozen, with Alba's body before him. But it wasn't Alba anymore. It was something that had taken her form, something dark, something that now stared at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his very soul. Clara, paralysed with fear, didn't know what to do. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hardly breathe. "Let's leave! Please, let's go!" she cried, desperate to escape. But Carlos didn't move. The cemetery was plunged into total darkness as the lights went out, leaving them in the oppressive, suffocating blackness. The only sound was the distorted, terrifying voice of Alba still echoing in the air. "You shouldn't have opened the grave," the voice repeated, multiplying, as if it were coming from all directions at once. Carlos finally snapped out of his paralysis. He jerked to his feet, trying to flee from the coffin, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His legs trembled, and each step he took felt heavier than the last. Clara grabbed his arm, pulling him with all her strength, trying to drag him away from this cursed place. "Run, Carlos! Please, run!" she begged, her voice breaking as they moved further from the grave. But as they moved away, something strange happened. They felt a force, something invisible, pulling them back toward the coffin. It was as if an unseen hand was trying to drag them back to that cursed spot. Carlos looked back in horror. There, in the coffin, was Alba, or what had once been Alba, sitting up slowly, methodically, with movements that were unnaturally deliberate. The air had grown colder, and the voices around them grew louder, more insistent, more horrifying. "We have to close the grave! Now!" Carlos shouted suddenly, his voice filled with the clarity of one who had realised the horrible truth. They couldn't outrun it. Whatever had been awakened was coming for them, and they had made a terrible mistake. "Heiser es la única manera de detener esto," Clara dijo, su voz temblorosa. Aunque aterrorizada, ella asintió. Sabía que no podían dejar el ataúd abierto. No después de lo que habían presenciado. Con todas sus fuerzas, ambos comenzaron a echar tierra sobre el ataúd nuevamente, cerrando el portal que, sin querer, habían abierto. Los susurros se hicieron más fuertes, más amenazadores. Sin embargo, poco a poco comenzaron a desvanecerse, a medida que el ataúd se volvía a cubrir. Cuando finalmente lo taparon por completo, un profundo silencio llenó el cementerio. Todo se detuvo. El viento dejó de soplar. La sensación opresiva en el aire desapareció. Carlos cayó de rodillas, agotado. Sus manos temblaban y su cuerpo estaba cubierto de sudor. Clara, a su lado, sollozaba en silencio, incapaz de asimilar lo que acababan de vivir. Ambos permanecieron así por unos momentos, tratando de recuperar la calma. La oscuridad seguía envolviéndolos, pero ya no había esa sensación de peligro inminente. ¿Qué fue eso?, preguntó Clara, su voz entrecortada, sin esperar realmente una respuesta. Carlos no respondió. Solo podía pensar en su hija, en lo que había sucedido, lo que fuera que habían visto. Lo que sea que había tomado el cuerpo de Alba ya no estaba más allí. Pero en el fondo, algo le decía que aquello no había terminado. Carlos y Clara se quedaron en el cementerio un largo rato después de haber cerrado la tumba. No podían entender completamente lo que había pasado, pero había algo claro. Había algo oscuro y peligroso asociado al cuerpo de Alba. Algo que no podían permitir que se desatara nuevamente. «Necesitamos ayuda», murmuró Clara, aún temblando. «No podemos dejarlo así. ¿Y si vuelve? ¿Y si no hemos terminado con esto?» Carlos la miró agotado, con los ojos llenos de tristeza. Sabía que su hermana tenía razón. No podían simplemente ignorar lo que acababa de ocurrir. Lo que habían visto no era natural, y temía que cerrar la tumba no hubiera sido suficiente. «Tienes razón», dijo, su voz apenas un susurro. «Pero ¿quién nos puede ayudar con algo así?» Clara, intentando calmarse, pensó en la única persona en la que podría confiar para algo tan fuera de lo común: el sacerdote de la iglesia local, el padre Mateo. Im era un hombre sabio, conocido por su experiencia en asuntos espirituales y por haber ayudado a otras familias con fenómenos inexplicables. Sin perder más tiempo, Clara convenció a Carlos de ir a buscarlo. Llegaron a la iglesia justo antes del amanecer, agotados pero decididos. El padre Mateo los recibió con preocupación al ver el estado en que ambos se encontraban. Apenas entraron, Clara, aún conmocionada, relató todo lo sucedido en el cementerio. Cada palabra que salía de su boca parecía más surrealista que la anterior, pero el sacerdote los escuchaba con calma, sin interrumpir. Cuando terminaron, el padre Mateo respiró hondo y se levantó lentamente. Caminó hacia un pequeño estante, tomó un antiguo libro de oraciones y se volvió hacia ellos. «Lo que han visto no es desconocido para mí», dijo en voz baja, como si eligiera cuidadosamente sus palabras. «Hay fuerzas antiguas, almas que no encuentran descanso, que pueden poseer el cuerpo de los muertos si ciertas condiciones se cumplen. Pero no es algo común, y mucho menos en un lugar como este». Carlos sintió un escalofrío recorrerle la espalda. La palabra «poseer» se clavó en su mente como una espina. «Padre, ¿qué podemos hacer para asegurarnos de que Alba, o lo que sea que haya tomado su cuerpo, no regrese?», preguntó, su voz llena de desesperación. El sacerdote bajó la mirada pensativo. «No es una tarea sencilla», dijo. «Cerraron la tumba. Pero si ese espíritu o entidad aún está vinculado a su hija, no será suficiente. Debemos hacer un ritual de sellado, una oración poderosa para liberar a Alba de cualquier conexión con esa fuerza». Carlos nodded, his expression darkened with resolve. He was ready to do whatever it took to protect his daughter. Even though his heart ached at the thought of what had to be done, there was no turning back. What had started the night before must be finished once and for all. «Then let's do it," he said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. «I don't want her to be trapped any longer," he continued, his voice breaking with emotion. Father Mateo, standing firm, instructed them that they would return to the cemetery at dusk, the perfect moment to perform the ritual. During the day, Carlos and Clara tried to rest, but the weight of what was coming kept them awake. Neither of them could sleep, knowing that the night would bring an encounter that would alter their lives forever. As the sun began to set, casting a dark shadow across the horizon, Carlos, Clara, and Father Mateo made their way back to the cemetery. They carried with them the necessary items for the ritual: candles, holy water, and the ancient prayer book that the priest had brought from the church. The air was thick with tension, and each step they took towards Alba's grave felt heavier than the last. When they finally reached the tomb, Father Mateo knelt before it and began preparing an improvised altar. He carefully arranged the candles in a circle around the spot where Carlos and Clara had sealed the coffin. The flickering light of the flames danced in the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Carlos couldn't tear his eyes away from the disturbed earth before him. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't just fear that gripped him. There was something else. an unsettling feeling that his daughter was still there, trapped between this world and the next. And worst of all, he couldn't do anything to help her. "Do not break the circle during the ritual," Father Matteo warned them sternly. "What we are about to face is dangerous. This entity will try to resist being cast out, but we must remain strong." Clara, though trembling, nodded determinedly. Carlos did the same, though his thoughts were elsewhere. All he wanted was for this to end, so that Alba could finally rest in peace. Father Matteo began chanting the prayers in Latin, his voice deep and reverent. The ancient words filled the air with a haunting solemnity. As the priest recited the prayers, the atmosphere shifted, the temperature dropped, and an unsettling breeze started to swirl around the circle of candles. The flames flickered but didn't extinguish. Suddenly, a low, unsettling sound emanated from the earth, like a whisper or something moving beneath the grave. Clara took a frightened step back, but Carlos immediately grasped her hand, pulling her back into the circle. They couldn't afford to show any weakness now. The priest's chanting grew louder, more intense, and just then, the ground above the coffin began to stir. The whispers turned into agonizing moans, and an invisible force seemed to rise from the earth itself. Carlos could feel something watching them, something dark and ancient that had been waiting for this very moment to escape. "Father, quickly!" Carlos cried, panic rising in his chest. Without hesitation, Father Matteo threw holy water onto the grave while continuing the incantation. The earth trembled more violently now, as if something below was fighting to break free. They knew the pain would stay with them, but they had done the right thing. Alba was no longer physically with them, but her memory would live on, and now, finally, she was at peace. Weeks passed since that night in the cemetery. Life in the small Spanish village slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But for Carlos and Clara, nothing would ever be the same. They had learned to live with Alba's absence, though the pain of her loss still weighed heavily on their hearts. Yet something had changed. The terror that had haunted them that night no longer had a grip on them. While sadness lingered, a strange sense of peace had begun to settle in. Carlos decided it was time to leave his old house. The memories of Alba filled every corner, and while they were precious, it had become too painful to remain there. He found a small house on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by trees and silence. It was the solitude he needed to begin anew, to heal. One day, as he was sorting through the few belongings he had decided to bring with him, something stopped him. He came across a small wooden box filled with drawings that Alba had made during her lifetime. Each one depicted scenes from their time together, the moments of joy they had shared. A bittersweet smile appeared on Carlos's face as he remembered how much Alba had loved to draw. It had been her way of expressing herself, of showing the love she felt for him. Among the drawings, Carlos found one he didn't recognize. It showed a figure of him and Alba, hand in hand, standing beneath a tree, with the sun shining down on them. At the bottom, in large, messy letters, was written, "Always together, Papa." Carlos felt a lump form in his throat as he gently stroked the paper, as if by doing so, he could once again feel his daughter's presence. It was a reminder that although Alba was no longer physically by his side, her love would never fade. It lived on in the memories, in the small details, and in that final drawing she had left him. Tears filled Carlos's eyes as he carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his pocket. He promised himself that Alba was at peace, and now he would begin to find his peace as well. The soft wind rustled through the trees outside the house, and for a brief moment, Carlos felt an inexplicable warmth in his chest. It was as if Alba was saying goodbye once more, but this time, it was with love and serenity, not fear. He allowed himself to smile for the first time in weeks. The road to healing would be long, but deep down, he knew that somehow, in some way, they would always be together. And so, with a heart filled with bittersweet peace, Carlos began his journey towards healing, knowing that though the pain of loss might never truly fade, love had the power to transform it into something enduring and beautiful.